Watch Nick Patrick's hand. December 28, 1997. The MCI Center in Washington, D.C. 17,500 people who had clawed their way through the holiday season carrying a single, almost religious conviction. Tonight was the night. 18 months of compound narrative interest. 18 months of a promise accumulating in the dark, like a debt nobody had the courage to call in. Watch Patrick's hand rise. Watch it fall. 1, 2, 3. The arena didn't erupt. It didn't explode. It went quiet in the specific, hollow way of a room full of people who have just watched something fail them and don't yet have the language to explain why they feel personally robbed. The count was supposed to be fast, corrupt, visibly, obviously, narratively fast. Fast enough that Bret Hart himself, a man whose real-world betrayal had detonated across the wrestling world 3 weeks earlier, could sprint to ringside, invoke justice, demand the restart, and give Sting the clean, cathartic 16-months-in-the-making victory the story had been building toward since October of 1996. That was the plan, but then Nick Patrick's hand came down at a perfectly normal pace. A legitimate pace. A pace that said to thousands of people in the building and hundreds of thousands watching at home that this match is over, that Hogan has won. Clean. What followed, Hart appearing confused, the restart happening anyway, and Sting eventually winning by submission. It looked like a fever dream to everyone watching, and a punchline with no joke preceding it. A resolution with no conflict to resolve. Nobody agrees on exactly why it happened. Patrick says he received contradictory instructions and couldn't locate anyone with actual authority to clarify before the bell rang.
And he told me to just do a straight 1, 2, 3 count, not a fast count.
Hogan had apparently expressed doubts about Sting's physical condition. Bischoff would later describe the whole catastrophe as a miscommunication, which is technically accurate and completely insufficient. But the specific reason Patrick counted incorrectly is almost beside the point, because the terrifying thing, the thing that should make you feel a specific, creeping dread if you think about it long enough, is that how the error was structurally possible. That the most important match in the history of WCW could arrive at its single most critical moment without anyone definitively, unambiguously in charge of what happened next. In order to understand how a company builds itself into that situation, you have to go back 14 months, to a moment that, at the time, looked like just another simple story beat, but it turned out to be the most important creative decision WCW ever made. In late October 1996, Steve Borden walked out of a WCW locker room and didn't come back. Sting was never the biggest star of WCW. Hogan arrived carrying a decade of mainstream cultural saturation. Flair was the definitive figure of the company's entire history. But Sting was the one who stayed. When Flair left for the WWF in 1991, in a dispute ugly enough to become industry folklore, when management changed again and again, when the television was at various points genuinely, embarrassingly unwatchable, Sting stayed. He was the company's loyalty, rendered in face paint and war cries. So when the NWO sent out a fake Sting to attack WCW wrestlers during a tag match, this wasn't just another cheap angle. It was a surgical strike against the single thing WCW possessed that wasn't imported, acquired, or borrowed. Because if the audience couldn't trust Sting, they couldn't trust anything WCW had ever claimed to stand for. The real Sting came out at Fall Brawl 1996 and cleared the ring. He proved he was exactly who he'd always been. Then he looked at his own locker room, at the people who'd spent weeks choosing not to believe him, and left. He came back 21 days later, changed. Long black coat, white face paint pulled down his face in black streaks like something torn open. No crowd playing. No war cries, none of the enormous, joyful performance of heroism that had defined him for 8 years. The image lifted directly from the 1994 film The Crow, a gothic figure moving through the world without interacting with it, waiting for a reckoning that had not yet arrived. He said 7 words to the camera.
But the only thing that's for sure about Sting is nothing's for sure.
Then he disappeared into the rafters. And he stayed there. Every week, the NWO dominated without consequence. Every week, Sting watched from above, silent, unreadable. The story was simple and ancient and almost unbearably effective. Evil runs unchecked. The lone incorruptible witness watches. And eventually, someday, the reckoning will arrive. The audience believed it completely. By December 1997, that belief was the single most valuable thing in professional wrestling. More valuable than the NWO. More valuable than Hogan. More valuable than the production infrastructure and the Turner money and the 16 consecutive months of winning the Monday Night Ratings War. WCW had built, almost by accident, a narrative of genuinely staggering proportions. The kind that audiences hold inside themselves, carry home, think about in the days between shows. And on the most important night they'd ever had, they broke it. The promise had been kept alive through 16 months of disciplined restraint. The contracts that made that restraint possible were the same contracts that had already made the conclusion impossible to control. Both things were about to become visible at once. The ironic paradox at WCW's core was this. The thing killing the company in late '97 was the exact same thing that had saved it in 1995 and 1996. Eric Bischoff's talent acquisition strategy was in the context of a company fighting for its life against the WWF's long institutional dominance was genuinely brilliant. To pry Scott Hall and Kevin Nash out of their WWF contracts, he offered guaranteed money completely divorced from performance metrics. Hall and Nash would get paid the same, whether the arena was sold out or half empty, whether they got over or didn't. Nash was contracted at a reported $1.2 million annually for 120 dates. And then came the clause that would define the entire collapse, the Favored Nations Clause. If WCW ever signed anyone to a higher guaranteed salary, their contracts would automatically escalate to match it. They didn't have to negotiate. They didn't have to perform better. They simply had to exist. And the moment a more expensive talent arrived, the clause would fire automatically. So when WCW signed Bret Hart at a reported $2.5 million per year, Nash's contract inflated to nearly $2 million automatically. Hall and Nash had to explicitly waive the clause just to allow the Hart acquisition to proceed at all. The inmates had the deed to the asylum, 3 sets of keys, and a favorable subletting arrangement. But it was Hulk Hogan who had something even more destructive than a Favored Nations Clause. Creative control. Legally binding, contractually ironclad approval over every match, finish, every storyline, every character direction involving him. His contract also paid him $20,000 a month simply to wear NWO merchandise on television, which meant he had a direct financial stake in ensuring the faction never reached a conclusion, never lost decisively. WCW's most powerful villain was being paid monthly to stay villainous in real life as well. The incentive structure of his contract ran in the precise opposite direction of any coherent long-term storytelling. The booking committee, Kevin Sullivan, Terry Taylor, Dusty Rhodes, could plan. They simply could not execute. Terry Taylor was given responsibility for long-term storytelling without the actual authority to see any of it through, and he resigned in frustration. The people nominally in charge of the product were subordinate to the people appearing in it. WCW didn't have a booking committee. They had a hostage negotiation. A beautifully lit cage they had built around themselves, occupied with enormous, cheerful enthusiasm, blissfully unaware the door only locked from one direction. Success had made all of this invisible. When your show is winning the ratings war every week, when the buy rates are shattering records, when arenas are selling out, there is no incentive to examine the infrastructure generating those results. You only discover the rot when the ceiling comes cracking down. And the ceiling was already cracking. The audience that would pull it down was watching television on the other channel, and they looked nothing like anything WCW's models had predicted. To understand what was building on that other channel, you have to stop looking at wrestling for a moment. You have to look at 1997 America. The Dow Jones was surging. The tech sector was producing paper millionaires with a velocity that felt almost accusatory if you weren't among them. Business magazines were printing breathless cover stories about the new prosperity. And simultaneously, in December of that year alone, 58,000 Americans received layoff notices, a 56% increase from the prior year. a TNT, Boeing, Chase Manhattan. The blue-chip institutions that had made generational promises of stability were dismantling those promises in press releases, and their stock prices went up while they did it. The traditional wrestling hero, honorable, patient rule-following, had stopped functioning as an aspiration. Virtue had become associated with compliance, with being the guy who plays by the rules until the company calls while you're injured and tells you you're fired. The culture was done with heroes who told you to say your prayers and eat your vitamins. WCW had the cool kids. The NWO's detached cynicism was sophisticated, elegant, the calling card of an audience that considered itself too intelligent for traditional wrestling heroism. But ironic detachment has a ceiling. 1997 wasn't looking for cool, it was looking for rage. And rage was something one man had actually earned, and the laboratory where he'd earned it was just a bingo hall in Philadelphia. Extreme Championship Wrestling operated on a budget that would have embarrassed most regional promotions. Paul Heyman's genius was making the limitation itself the point, positioning ECW as the nirvana to the mainstream promotion's hair metal. Raw, deliberately unpolished, designed to destroy every artificiality that had accumulated in wrestling over the previous decade. ECW had conditioned its audience to expect legitimate violence, adult language, and storylines that deliberately collapsed the boundary between performance and reality. But more importantly, it was the laboratory where the next era's He ended up in ECW, and Heyman told him to channel what he was actually feeling. The legitimate, completely real contempt for the organization that had discarded him. That emotional wound became the blueprint for everything that followed. By early 1997, the struggling WWF initiated a working relationship with ECW, importing their talent onto Raw in a chaotic, semi-scripted invasion. The immediate ratings impact was modest, but the structural impact was seismic. It served as a live test of the Attitude Era before anyone had named it, importing ECW's most essential finding, that an audience raised on the internet and South Park was done with manufactured sincerity. They wanted something that would cost somebody something real. ECW was the unpaid research and development department for the WWF's impending dominance. By 1997, Austin was standing inside WWF rings. Every person who'd watched a corporate executive explain their elimination with the word restructuring. Every middleman was presented with a smile. The WWF had the guy your dad wanted to be. The divergence between the two companies was becoming clinical in its clarity by mid-1997, and you could see it most obviously not only in the storylines, but in the cameras as well. WCW's broadcast was essentially a real estate camera, pulling back to show scale, how massive the production had become. The philosophy? Make the audience feel the size of what they're watching. The WWF's camera was doing something fundamentally different, closing in, getting personal. The editing rhythm of a McMahon-Austin confrontation felt like a bar fight. Short, sharp, cut on impact. Every frame loaded with subtext. Where WCW used production to manufacture awe, the WWF manufactured intimacy. Made you feel like you were watching something real and dangerous from 3 feet away. The Nielsen demographic data from late 1997 told you exactly what this meant, long before the aggregate ratings caught up. WCW was still winning total viewership, but the number was being propped up by its over 50 audience, viewers watching out of nostalgia. In the 2 to 17 age group, the children, the future of the business, the people who would buy t-shirts and action figures for the next 15 years. The WWF won 23 of the first 24 weeks of the ratings war. 23 of 24. WCW didn't lose the Monday Night War in April 1998. They lost it in the fourth quarter of 1997. The scoreboard just hadn't updated. And 6 weeks before Starrcade, something happened that didn't just change professional wrestling. It blew the roof off the building. November 9th, 1997. The Survivor Series, Montreal, Quebec. Bret Hart was the WWF champion. He was also, as of 3 weeks earlier, the owner of a signed WCW contract worth $2.5 million annually, because McMahon had approached Hart earlier that year and admitted, in an act of extraordinary institutional vulnerability, that the company could no longer afford the unprecedented 20-year deal they'd signed in 1996. Hart had negotiated with WCW and signed, but he was still the champion. McMahon had a specific, documented, years-old reason to be terrified of what that meant. In 1995, Alundra Blaze had walked to the ring on the first Nitro and dropped the WWF Women's title into a trash can on live television. He was not going to allow Bret Hart to hand WCW an even more devastating version of the same moment. Hart had a clause granting him creative control over his exit. He refused to lose the championship to Shawn Michaels in Canada. He proposed forfeiting the title on Raw the following night instead. McMahon refused. And then, with a coldness that should not have been possible from an institution Hart had served for 14 years, he arranged an alternative. During the main event, as Michaels applied Hart's own finishing hold against him, McMahon ordered referee Earl Hebner to signal for the bell. Hart had not submitted. The match was awarded to Michaels without Hart's knowledge or consent. Hart spat directly in McMahon's face. He destroyed the ringside broadcast equipment with completely genuine, completely unperformed fury. Backstage, he hit McMahon hard enough to knock him unconscious. The Undertaker pounded on his locked door, demanding accountability. Several roster members threatened to boycott the following night's Raw entirely. A walkout averted only by Hart himself, who told them not to sacrifice their family's financial security over his personal crisis. A documentary crew filing Hart for a Canadian television special captured the backstage aftermath in real time. That footage circulated immediately through early internet wrestling forums and ignited the most intense debate the medium had ever produced. Wrestling had operated under kayfabe, the unspoken mutual agreement that the fiction was real, for over a century. Montreal didn't erode kayfabe. Montreal detonated it. ESPN covered it. Canadian newspapers covered it as a genuine labor dispute. And the audience watching Raw the following Monday wasn't watching fiction. They were watching a corporation manage the documented fallout from an act of institutional bad faith. McMahon didn't retreat from the controversy. He weaponized it. He sat down with Jim Ross on live television, visibly uncomfortable in a way that does not read as performed, ill at ease in the specific manner of a man trying to control a situation he knows he cannot fully control, and said,
"I truly believe that Bret Hart screwed Bret Hart."
He was saying one thing, but you were watching something else entirely surface through the saying of it. The character of Mr. McMahon was born in that interview. And the reason it worked, the reason it became one of the most effective villainous personas in entertainment history, is that the authenticity underneath was completely undeniable. Because it was real. The man carrying that documented, mainstream-covered grievance was now walking into WCW, custom-built by history for the exact story WCW was theoretically telling. What the company chose to do with him would reveal, more clearly than any rating, exactly what it had become. 3 weeks later, the most documented victim of institutional betrayal in professional wrestling walked into WCW. And in 3 weeks, WCW would have the chance to use him in the most important match the company had ever staged. This is the part where we come back to Washington, D.C. December 28, 1997, the MCI Center. A pay-per-view buy rate of 1.9, the most commercially successful event in WCW history. The plan was precise. Nick Patrick executes a deliberately fast count during Hogan's pinfall. Bret Hart, the man who 3 weeks earlier had been stripped of a title by a corrupt referee counting a fall that shouldn't have been counted, sprints to ringside. He invokes justice. He demands the restart. The metatextual resonance is so complete it practically writes itself. The most publicly wronged man in wrestling, correcting the most corrupt finish in wrestling, at the culmination of the most important story in wrestling. Sting submits Hogan cleanly. 16 months of compressed catharsis in 90 seconds. But Nick Patrick's hand came down at a perfectly normal pace. To the millions watching at home, Hogan had just pinned Sting, clean, in the center of the ring. So when Hart sprinted to ringside to dispute a fast count that hadn't happened, the audience stared at their televisions in genuine bewilderment. And when the restart happened anyway, when Sting eventually won by submission, it registered as nothing. A punchline without a joke. A resolution without a conflict. What happened backstage has been argued over for decades, in ways that are themselves revealing. Bischoff claimed Sting arrived out of shape, insufficiently prepared. Patrick says he received conflicting instructions from multiple people with incompatible agendas and couldn't find anyone with actual authority to resolve the contradiction before the match began. Both accounts are probably accurate, and they share the same diagnosis. On the most important night in WCW history, the people responsible for the most important finish in WCW history couldn't agree on what that finish was. Because the person with the most authority over what happened in that match was not the booker or the promoter. It was the performer being pinned. And that performer had expressed uncertainty about the outcome in the hours before the show. The booking committee had no mechanism to override him. The contract said they couldn't. The audience didn't know the exact details, but they felt it. They felt that the company they'd invested in couldn't be trusted to deliver the end of its own story. That is a wound that doesn't close. WCW entered 1998 holding every structural advantage. The bigger television contract, the larger guaranteed roster, the record buy rates, the 16-month ratings dominance that was still, on paper, ongoing. But two things were also true. Bret Hart, acquired at $2.5 million per year, the most narratively resonant figure in the industry, custom built by fate for the exact story WCW was theoretically telling, was being flown first class to arenas, told minutes before broadcast that he was off tonight, and then flown home having accomplished nothing. WCW had found the grievance that fit him perfectly and then buried it, because the grievance that fit him was against the very people the machine had been built to protect. And in a corner of the card nobody was paying much attention to, a former NFL lineman with no professional wrestling background was winning matches in under 3 minutes. The audience was receiving it as authentic, terrifying ferocity, but management had quietly built a controlled environment designed to ensure his ceiling was never visible. The undefeated streak was still in its early chapters. Nobody had quite worked out yet what it was building toward, or how long it could run, or what would happen the moment the numbers stopped. But those were 1998's problems, and 1998 had plenty of them. An empty arena, an empty chair, and a moment so stupid, so nakedly corrupt, that it would become the single image people reach for when they try to explain how a company throws away a war it was winning. A title change that took 11 seconds and broke something that never quite healed. On the other side of the dial, something was catching fire in a way nobody had fully predicted. A man the company had written off was about to have the most important night of his career because an audience decided he'd earned it and refused to be told otherwise. A faction was about to stop being a backstage joke and start being the loudest thing in the room. And the era that had been building in the margins since that bingo hall in Philadelphia was about to stop being the future and become the present. Part 4 is where the scoreboard finally updates. If this is the kind of breakdown you're here for, drop a like, it genuinely helps, and subscribe if you aren't already. Thank you for staying till the end, and I'll see you next time with Part 4.